Today's case on Nightmare Truth is just one tale, but it is a tale that is so disturbing. You will need a drink or two, I think, after you have discovered it. Welcome to Nightmare Truth.
Richard Chase. If you do not know about him, then it will become a name that will soon haunt your nightmares. Born in 1950, he grew up in Sacramento, California, in a fairly quiet neighborhood. From a very early age, the troubled boy displayed signs that he wasn't quite all there and displayed early signs of becoming a psychopath. He would start fires and watch as the flames flickered, and the depravity in his soul heightened. He was prone to torturing animals and would often wet the bed. He was brought up in a very strict household by two parents who were far from kind and loving. It is alleged his mother may have abused him as a child. His father would often beat him. It wasn't long before Richard Chase soon turned to drink, which is what you may turn to when you hear the rest of this Nightmare Truth case. He was an alcoholic by the time he became a very disturbed teenager. He had been traveling this road to hell from a very young age, and he was going to take some poor innocent people with him in the near future. He was a decent-looking boy. He went out with quite a few girls during his high school years. Sadly for him, but lucky for them, he would often get dumped. He felt shame and would sometimes be mocked for he could not maintain an erection. This, and the fact he would many a time not even bother bathing. Disturbingly, though, he could maintain an erection when he thought of violent acts, murder and rape. He became convinced that his heart had stopped and he was dead, yet he would still try to make sure he was healthy, albeit in a rather unusual way. He would press orange peel against his forehead very hard in the belief that his body would absorb the healthy nutrients of the orange. He believed his skull was moving around inside his head and tearing itself apart to rearrange itself, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. It wanted to nurture his psyche into something rather depraved. The Nazis were trying to poison him by lacing the soap dish with poison. His mind was telling him this was so. He was angry and paranoid. He became convinced his mother was trying to poison him on behalf of the Nazi regime. His erratic, disturbing behavior caused unrest in the household. His father had enough. He had to leave. He eventually moved into an apartment with some friends. They were all young and ready to take on the world, but they weren't ready to take on Richard Chase. Richard Chase was smoking a lot of marijuana and taking acid and drinking booze like his life depended on it. When his roommates had guests around, Richard Chase didn't care. He would stroll around in front of them stark-balled naked. His roommates felt angry and a little uneasy at his wild behavior, and soon they all moved out, leaving Richard Chase alone. In the apartment, this was when things slowly began to escalate. He would find animals on the street and even neighbors' pets and take them to the apartment and kill them in the most horrific and violent ways. He would gut them and eat the animals' insides, raw. He even phoned one of the neighbors to tell them he had killed their dog. He would drink the blood. He was convinced in his own warped mind that the Nazis were trying to turn his blood into powder, so this was his way of saving himself. It was to be a never-ending desire to drink blood. He would often think about drinking fresh, human blood. He would even put the disemboweled animals in a blender and make a milkshake. I don't think you will find these flavors anytime soon at a McDonald's. It was in 1975 when he was hospitalized because he had injected rabbit blood into his veins, causing him to collapse and convulse. He was then admitted to a psychiatric hospital. His slippery slope down an extremely dark path was getting darker and darker. Soon there would be no light left. He soon earned the nickname Dracula from the staff. Why, you may ask? He would kill birds and then bite into their necks and drink their blood. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and was prescribed antipsychotic drugs. Once he was deemed to be rehabilitated, he was released into his mother's care, something which his mother did not seem to display much of. For some unknown reason, his mother decided Richard Chase did not need the antipsychotic drugs and stopped him from taking them. Things began to take a turn for the worse. He became obsessed with firearms and was an expert in gun care and reloading like a ninja. He once again began killing several animals to drink their blood. He was ordered to move out, so went to live in an apartment on his own. He lost his temper one day and stormed to his mother's house naked. Not before murdering a cat along the way. He threw the dead cat at his mother, who looked at him without a care in the world. He screamed as loud as he could, then got down on his knees and tore the cat open with his bare hands. He smeared the cat's blood all over his face while screaming. His mother just looked at him, then shut the door. He was getting worse. The anger inside and the voices were telling him to kill. December 27, 1977. Richard Chase got in his car and drove around. He stopped by a house and fired a .22 caliber handgun into the house abode by a Sacramento woman. The police were called and they found the bullet in her kitchen. It was extremely lucky no one was hurt. It was just 2 days later, on the 29th of December, he killed his first victim on what was to become an horrific, vile killing spree. Ambrose Pierce was a 51-year-old Sacramento family man who was on this unfortunate day on the driveway of his house helping his wife take in the groceries when Richard Chase drove past and fired a .22 caliber handgun which immediately killed Ambrose Pierce. His family were mortified. The police investigation discovered the bullets had come from the same handgun that was used just 2 days before to fire into a woman's home. But the police had no clues yet as to who may have committed this evil act. Shortly after his first murder, he tried to shoot a 12-year-old boy, but he missed and the boy got away. His bloodlust was about to get worse, much worse. Richard Chase would walk around and try the doors of several homes. If they were unlocked, he would invite himself in. He was questioned by the police. He stated that he thought he was allowed to enter homes if they were unlocked. He was given a caution, and that was that. Richard Chase then broke into the home of a married couple during the month of January 1978 and urinated into their young daughter's clothes drawer, then proceeded to shit on their young son's bed. The couple came home and the father began to beat Chase, but he escaped from the house, and they never saw him again. He would break into a few more homes, and in one of them he even disemboweled a dog. What happened next is truly shocking and disturbing. It will haunt your mind and is easily one of the most disturbing facts about this horrific killing spree. If you are disturbed by sexual violence, then I suggest you switch on to one of the other Nightmare Truth videos because it is sickening. It was the 23rd of January 1978. Richard Chase prowled the streets and tried the handle to see if a house was unlocked. Unfortunately, it was. What happened next is beyond depraved belief. He brazenly walked into a house and found Teresa Wallen, alone, just doing some chores. She now faced the depraved, violent, murderous Richard Chase. There was a moment of stillness, then he attacked. He pointed his .22 caliber handgun at her. Teresa Wallen raised her hand in the vain hope of protecting herself and her unborn baby, for she was 3 months pregnant at the time. He fired. The bullet went through her hand, then he quickly shot her in the head twice. She slumped to the floor. He wasn't finished yet. He pulled out a knife and proceeded to stab her 3 times in the abdomen. He sat there for a minute looking at the mutilated corpse of Teresa Wallen, then in a sickening, vile act, he had sex with her corpse. He began gutting her like a fish. He pulled out her organs and tasted the blood. He put some of the blood in an empty yogurt carton and drank it. He sliced off one of her nipples. The room was soaked in blood and organs trailed along the floor. He stepped out of the house and picked up some dog droppings which were in the garden. He then went back inside and stuffed the dog crap into her mouth and gouged out her eyes and stuffed the droppings inside the eye sockets. He was pure evil. He then calmly left. Teresa's husband David came home later to be greeted with the horrific nightmare. He found his mutilated wife on the floor, or what was left of her. He screamed the house down and ran to a neighbor's house screaming for help. The police were soon on the scene. What they saw would haunt their minds forever. Soon a profiler gave a summary of what Chase was all about, and it was pretty accurate. The police soon had some clues, but not yet enough to narrow down Richard Chase as a suspect. Just 4 days after the horrific murder of Teresa Wallen, he would strike again. The Vampire of Sacramento, as he would become to be known, would sink even further into the depths of depravity. He prowled the streets and tried a few homes which were locked, but he eventually found an unlocked house. He walked into homeowner 36-year-old Evelyn Miroth's home, who was there with her 6-year-old son Jason Miroth. She also had her nearly 2-year-old nephew, David Farrar, staying over, and her friend, Danny Meredith, was also there. Richard Chase quickly shot Danny Meredith as Evelyn was in the bathroom, unaware of what had just happened. Poor 6-year-old Jason Miroth ran off to his mother's bedroom screaming for his mom as Richard Chase went after him. Along the walk to the bedroom, he shot 22-month-old David Farrar dead in his playpen. A bullet hole was found in his pillow. In the bedroom, he found Jason cowering and shot him twice in the head. He then went into the bathroom and found a tearful, frightened Evelyn Miroth. He shot her in the head. He then dragged her body to the bedroom where the body of her 6-year-old son lay and began to sodomize her corpse. He sliced open her neck and drank her blood just like a vampire. He then, in a violent rage, stabbed her several times over in the anal passage. The stabbing was so severe it mutilated her uterus. He sliced her body wide open and drained her blood into a bucket, and then drank it all. But he wasn't finished yet. He went over to Danny Meredith's body and dragged it with all his might into the bathroom. He then split the skull open and gazed at the brain matter before scooping it out and eating it. There was a knock at the front door. It was a 6-year-old girl knocking on to see if Jason Miroth would play out. Richard Chase panicked. He grabbed the body of 22-month-old David Farrar and stole Danny Meredith's car and sped off. The young girl had seen Chase covered in blood and ran to tell a neighbor. The neighbor quickly ran into the home and was faced with the brutal massacre that had just occurred. The police were called and were quickly on the scene. They found fingerprints and shoe prints all over the blood-stained house. They still were not sure who it could be, but it would be only a matter of time, surely. Richard Chase went back to his apartment and sliced open the corpse of David Farrar. He sliced off his penis and in a grotesque act used it as a straw to drink blood. He cut off body parts and boiled them. He also had with him some of the internal organs from the massacre he'd committed. Just a few days before the massacre, Richard Chase had approached a girl by the name of Nancy Holden, who he used to know in school, and asked her for a ride into town, but she refused. She was a little unnerved. He seemed creepy. Her gut instinct was right. Going off the police bulletin, she recognized the description of the murderer to be Richard Chase, and 5 days after the Miroth massacre, she phoned the police and told them about Richard Chase. The police were soon at his apartment. They knocked on the door. It was a few minutes before he answered. They asked if they could come in, but he refused, so they waited. He came out eventually, and they grabbed him as other officers ran into the apartment. They were greeted with the horrific nightmare-inducing sight of a blood-spattered apartment. The blood covered almost every inch of wall. The stench was vomit-inducing. The blender he used to make blood-filled smoothies was caked in blood and filled with rotting organs. There were animal and human body parts found in the fridge, and they even found brain matter in a Tupperware box, which makes my Tupperware box with strawberry and cheese sandwiches seem boring in comparison. He was of course arrested, and I'm sure several cops that night went home and refused to eat their wives' home-cooked dinners. At last the Vampire of Sacramento was caught. 1979. Richard Chase stood trial for murder. The defense tried to get him off the death penalty by pleading he was insane, so should only be tried for first-degree murder, and just serve a few years in prison. He was found guilty of 6 charges of murder. The judge ruled the insanity plea was not convenient, so Richard Chase received a death penalty. He was condemned to die in a gas chamber. Whilst awaiting his death in San Quentin prison, he actually became a feared prisoner once it got out what acts he had committed. It was too much for some prisoners to comprehend, and they were scared of him. They would shout to him and encourage him to commit suicide. Richard Chase was prescribed antidepressants. Unbeknown to prison staff, he wasn't actually taking the medication. He was storing it up so he could commit suicide by overdose. And that's exactly what he did. It was December the 26th, 1980, Boxing Day, when a prison guard doing cell checks found his lifeless body, slumped on his bed. There was a suicide note in the cell. Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento, was no more.
Did you lock your door? No, I mean go and check. Did you lock your door? You wouldn't want anybody like Richard Chase coming through your door now, would you? Sleep tight.